There's a photograph on the mantel in our living room back in Guelph. My wife and I are standing in front of the cottage. She's maybe 32, I'm 34, and we're both sunburned and laughing at something I can't remember anymore. The dock is behind us, the kind of weathered gray wood that splinters if you walk it barefoot. We just put in the last post ourselves. Cost us 3 weekends and about 40 arguments. But we did it together. That cottage was supposed to be where our granddaughter took her first swim, where my wife would sit on that same dock with her morning coffee and watch the loons, the way she'd always talked about doing when we finally slowed down. It was supposed to be the place we'd return to every Thanksgiving, every October long weekend for the rest of our lives. I want you to hold on to that image of us laughing, because what I found when I pulled into that driveway on a Friday afternoon in October changed everything I thought I knew about my family. My wife and I had been married for 38 years. We met when I was working a surveying job just outside of Waterloo, and she was finishing her nursing degree. She was the most composed person I'd ever known, the kind of woman who didn't panic, who thought before she spoke, who kept her hands steady even when things fell apart around her. In 38 years, I had seen her cry, maybe a handful of times, at her mother's funeral. When our younger son was in hospital after his accident, the morning our dog didn't wake up. So when I tell you what I saw when I unlocked that cottage door, I need you to understand it didn't just alarm me. It stopped me cold in a way I hadn't felt since I was a young man. I'd driven up from Guelph alone. The plan had been for everyone to meet Saturday morning, my wife, my older son and his wife, my younger son and his girlfriend, and our granddaughter. But I'd wrapped up a week of helping a neighbor with his back fence earlier than expected on the Friday. And I thought, why not? Go up, get the place aired out, maybe split some of the birch I'd left stacked near the shed. Give myself one quiet evening before the family arrived. My wife knew I might come up early. She was finishing a shift at the community health center, where she still volunteered 2 days a week. Then she'd planned to drive up Saturday with my older son's family. That was the arrangement. I didn't call ahead. No reason to. The drive up through Wellington County and into Muskoka was the kind of October afternoon that makes you remember why you live in this country. The maples were burning orange and red along the highway, and the sky had that particular brightness you only get in the fall up here, the kind that makes everything look almost too clear. I had the radio on some old Tragically Hip that came on between the news, and I remember feeling, for about 90 minutes, genuinely at peace. I turned off the county road and onto the gravel lane that leads down to our property. The lane is about 400 meters, lined with white birch and poplar, and you can't see the cottage until you round the last bend. I noticed a car I didn't recognize parked near the woodshed. A dark gray sedan. Ontario plates. I didn't think much of it. Our neighbor across the lake sometimes sent his son over to check on the seasonal properties, and there were a few other cottages along the same lane. I parked, grabbed my bag from the back seat, and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. I stepped inside, and I heard it immediately. She was in the back bedroom, our room, the one that faces the water, and she was crying in a way that I can only describe as lost. Not grieving, not upset. Lost. Confused. Like someone who didn't know where they were. I dropped my bag on the floor and walked down the hall. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her coat, her purse on the floor beside her feet. Her eyes were open, but they weren't tracking properly. She looked at me when I came in, and I watched it take her a full 3 seconds to recognize me. 3 seconds. This woman who knows my footstep from 2 rooms away. "Robert," she said. And then she started crying harder. I sat down next to her and took her hands. They were cold. Her speech was slow when she tried to talk, and her words were slipping around each other in a way that made no sense. She kept saying she felt dizzy. She said she'd had a cup of tea, just 1 cup of tea, and she'd felt like this ever since. My wife doesn't drink. She takes no prescription medications. She was 61 years old and healthy enough to outpace most people half her age on a hiking trail. 1 cup of tea. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I got her lying down, pulled the blanket over her, and told her to stay still. She grabbed my wrist before I could stand up. "There are people here," she said. Her eyes were trying to focus on me. A woman came with papers. "Robert, I didn't understand what they were." I asked her where. She pointed toward the back of the cottage, toward the deck. I stood up and walked out of that bedroom and down the short hallway that opens onto the kitchen and the sliding glass door that leads to the deck. My daughter-in-law was sitting at the outdoor table with two people I had never seen before. There was a bottle of prosecco open. There were glasses. There was a thick folder of documents spread across the table, and my daughter-in-law had a pen in her hand, and she was laughing at something one of the strangers had just said. She hadn't heard me come in. None of them had. I stood at the glass door for a moment and watched. The woman across from my daughter-in-law was middle-aged, professional-looking, with a leather satchel propped against her chair, the kind of bag a notary or a lawyer carries. The man to my daughter-in-law's left had a real estate company logo on the folder in front of him. I could read the name from where I was standing. My daughter-in-law turned the document over and pointed at something near the bottom of the page and said, "Once she signs here, we can move on the listing by end of November. Before the snow comes." I opened the sliding door. The three of them looked up at the same time. My daughter-in-law's expression went through about 4 changes in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise. Recognition. Something I can only call a calculation. Then a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad," she said, "we weren't expecting you until tomorrow." I looked at the documents on the table. I looked at the man with the real estate folder. I looked at the woman with the leather satchel. And then I looked back at my daughter-in-law. "No," I said. "You weren't." She started talking immediately, the way a person does when they've been caught, and they're still deciding whether to run or explain. She said this wasn't what it looked like. She said she was just trying to help us. That she'd been worried about us, about our finances, about the upkeep of the property, about what would happen as we got older. She said she'd spoken with a financial advisor, and they'd both agreed that liquidating an asset like the cottage now, while the Muskoka market was still strong, was the smart thing to do. She said she was going to bring it up over the weekend. She just wanted to have everything organized first. Organized. I asked her about my wife. She didn't hesitate. She said my wife had been tired from the drive and had lain down. She said she'd made her a cup of chamomile tea before she rested. I asked the notary to pack her documents and leave. I asked the real estate agent to take his folder and go. I told them that anything they had been asked to witness or facilitate on this property had been done without my knowledge, without my consent, and without the legal capacity of the person they believed they were dealing with. The notary stood up without a word. The real estate agent looked at my daughter-in-law once, then picked up his things. When they were gone, I asked my daughter-in-law to tell me exactly what she had put in that tea. She said it was just chamomile. She said I was being dramatic. She looked me directly in the face and she said, "You're not well either. That's what worries me." There it was. I want you to think about what that phrase means when someone says it to you in your own home. You're not well. Not as a concern, as a statement of intent. I had spent 35 years as a civil engineer. I had designed load-bearing structures. I had read contracts and assessed risk and caught errors that other people missed because I knew how to keep my thinking clear under pressure. My wife had worked in healthcare for decades. We paid our taxes. We managed our own finances. We had a financial advisor we'd worked with for 20 years at a credit union in Guelph. We had a will, an updated one, drafted by a lawyer we'd chosen ourselves. We were 61 and 63 years old. We were not confused. We were not frail. We were not incapable. And this woman, who had been married to my older son for 7 years, who had sat at our dinner table every Christmas, who had held our granddaughter at the hospital the morning she was born, had driven my wife to our cottage, given her something that made her disoriented and slow, and was in the process of getting her signature on a power of attorney document that would have handed over control of our financial and legal decisions to my older son and herself. I called my younger son. He picked up on the second ring. I told him to come up tonight, not tomorrow. I told him I needed him here. He heard something in my voice and he didn't ask questions. He just said, "I'm leaving in 20 minutes." While I waited for him, I sat with my wife. She was more alert by then. Whatever she'd been given was wearing off, though she still had a headache that wouldn't let up. She remembered my daughter-in-law arriving at the cottage with 2 other people. She remembered being given the tea and feeling strange almost immediately. She remembered being handed documents and being told they were just household planning paperwork, nothing urgent. She said she'd asked to call me before signing anything, and my daughter-in-law had said, "You don't want to worry him. He's been so stressed." She said her hands didn't feel like her own hands when she held the pen. She hadn't signed. Thank God. She hadn't signed. My daughter-in-law stayed inside. I could hear her on the phone in the kitchen, speaking quietly, urgently. When I walked through once to get water for my wife, she stopped talking. She looked at me with an expression I didn't recognize. Not guilt, not fear exactly. More like someone reassessing a plan. My younger son arrived just after 9 o'clock. He came through the door, took one look at his mother lying on the bed, took one look at my face and said, "Tell me everything." I told him. He sat very still while I talked, the way he used to as a boy when he was listening hard. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, this isn't the first thing she's done." I looked at him. He told me he'd noticed things over the past year. Small things individually, but a pattern when you lined them up. My daughter-in-law had twice asked my older son about the cottage's assessed value. She'd asked my wife, during a family dinner last spring, whether we'd ever considered a retirement residence just for down the road, just to have a plan. She'd raised the idea of adding both herself and my older son to our bank accounts as a convenience for when we traveled. She'd forwarded my wife an article about a family in Hamilton whose aging parents had developed dementia and left the family in chaos because they hadn't arranged power of attorney in time. None of these things, on their own, would have alarmed me. Taken together, with what I'd found on that deck, they formed something I could see clearly now. My younger son had done something I hadn't known about. 3 weeks earlier, after one of the cottage conversations made him uneasy, he'd spoken with a friend of his who worked in estate law in Kitchener. Just a casual conversation, just to understand what the risks were. His friend had told him that financial elder abuse, and he'd used that term specifically, was one of the fastest growing categories of fraud in Canada, and that the majority of reported cases involved adult children or their spouses. He told him the most common mechanism was a power of attorney obtained when the parent was temporarily incapacitated, confused, or pressured. My younger son had not told me this because he hadn't wanted to cause alarm over what he hoped was nothing. It wasn't nothing. We spent 2 hours at the kitchen table that night. My daughter-in-law had retreated to the smaller bedroom and closed the door, going through what we knew, what we could document, and what the next steps were. My younger son called his lawyer friend from the cottage. The friend walked us through it clearly. My wife had not signed anything, which meant no fraud had been completed. But the intent and the preparation were documentable, and the fact that my wife had been given something without her knowledge that altered her cognitive state was a serious matter on its own. He said we should contact the Ontario Provincial Police. The next morning, 2 OPP officers came to the cottage. My daughter-in-law came out of the bedroom when she heard the knock. I watched her face change when she saw the uniforms. She looked at me, then at my younger son, then at the documents still sitting on the deck table where I'd left them deliberately, untouched since the night before. She said, very quietly, "I was trying to help." One of the officers asked her to please come with them to answer some questions. I called my older son after the officers left with my daughter-in-law. This was the conversation I had dreaded more than any other. He is my firstborn. I have known him for 40 years, known his voice since before he could speak in sentences, known the way he goes quiet when he's ashamed, the way his breathing changes when he's about to cry. He answered the phone, and I told him where I was and what had happened. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Dad," just that, just my name, in a voice that told me he had not known, that some part of what was happening had been hidden from him too, and that he was now understanding things that had confused him for months. He drove up that morning. He sat at the kitchen table across from his mother, and he put his head in his hands, and he cried in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. My wife, who was still pale and moving slowly, reached across the table and put her hand on his arm. That is the kind of woman she is. That is the kind of family we raised. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing someone, but from finding out that something you believed was solid was not. My older son had to live in that grief over the weeks that followed. He had to look back over years of his marriage and understand what had been manipulation and what had been real. He had to accept that someone he loved had been willing to use him and use his parents for financial gain. I don't say this to make him a victim, but I say it because it's true, and because I think it matters to understand how these things work. The people at the center of a scheme like this are rarely the only people hurt by it. My daughter-in-law was charged under Section 380 of the Criminal Code of Canada fraud over $5,000, as well as a charge related to administering a noxious substance under Section 245. The cottage, the assessed value of which sat at just over $800,000 in the current Muskoka market, was the asset she had been moving to liquidate. The notary, it turned out, had not been fully informed of the circumstances and cooperated immediately with investigators. The real estate agent was interviewed and cleared. My wife recovered fully within 48 hours. Her doctor in Guelph ran a panel of tests and confirmed she'd been given a sedative available over the counter in higher doses than the label recommends. If you know what you're looking for, the doctor filed the required report. I want to tell you about the Thanksgiving weekend we ended up having, because it didn't look anything like what I'd imagined, and it was still, somehow, one of the most honest weekends of my life. My older son stayed at the cottage with us. His daughter, our granddaughter, came up with my younger son's girlfriend on the Saturday, as originally planned. And no one told her anything except that Grandma had been feeling a bit under the weather. She is 4 years old. She spent the Saturday morning collecting rocks along the shoreline and presenting them to my wife one at a time like they were prizes. We had turkey on the Sunday. My older son cooked it because my wife was resting and because he needed something to do with his hands. My younger son made the stuffing from my mother-in-law's recipe, the one we've used for 30 years with the sage and the dried cranberries. It was cold enough by Sunday evening that we lit the fireplace for the first time that fall. Canadian Thanksgiving is the second Monday in October. The maples had peaked and were just starting to drop. The lake was that flat gray color it gets in the late fall, before the ice comes. And the loons were still there. You could hear them calling across the water in the evening. My wife sat on the dock with her coffee on the Monday morning, wrapped in the old wool blanket we keep on the hook by the back door, and I sat beside her. And we didn't talk for a long time. She said, "Eventually, I want to repaint the dock." I said I thought that was a good idea. She said she wanted to do it in the spring, herself, the way she'd always wanted to. And I said I'd help. And she said, "I know you will." That is a small conversation. I understand that. But I want you to understand what it meant to have it. That the dock was still ours. That the spring was still ours. That we were still here, together, making plans that belonged to us. In the months that followed, we updated our power of attorney documents through our own lawyer, both my wife and I, separately and clearly, on our own terms, witnessed by people we chose. We added a provision that any major financial decision involving our assets required both signatures and a 30-day notice period. Our lawyer called it a considered capacity clause. I called it a lesson we'd paid for the hard way. I also did something I hadn't expected to do. I wrote a letter. Not to my daughter-in-law, not to anyone in the legal process, but to the community health center where my wife volunteers. The center runs a program for older adults in Wellington County education sessions on financial safety, legal rights, how to identify the warning signs of elder financial abuse. I wrote to offer to speak at one of their sessions. I told them what had happened to us. I told them I was 63 years old and had spent my career in engineering and still hadn't recognized the warning signs until I was standing on my own deck reading a real estate folder. The coordinator called me the following week and said she'd had 3 other families contact her that same month with similar stories. 3 families. In one county. In 1 month. My older son is in therapy now. He and his wife are separated, and the process ahead of them is painful and long. And I will not pretend otherwise. He comes up to the cottage when he can, often with his daughter, and we have learned to sit together in the silences the way families do when something is broken, and you're still figuring out which pieces can be put back. Last month, he helped me split the rest of that birch I'd left by the shed. We worked for about 2 hours without talking much. Just the rhythm of the maul and the smell of fresh-cut wood, and at some point he stopped and looked out at the lake and said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know you are." He said, "I should have seen it." I said, "So should I." That's the hardest thing about what happened, not the legal part, not even the fear of what could have been. The hardest part is understanding that the people who love us can still, under the right pressure and the wrong influence, become people we don't recognize, and that protecting yourself from that doesn't make you suspicious or paranoid or difficult. It makes you clear-eyed. It makes you someone who has taken their life seriously enough to defend it. My wife still volunteers at the health center. She has started sitting in on the elder financial safety sessions, and a few times now she has shared what happened to her. Not the full story, but enough. She says the women in those sessions look at her the way people look at someone who has survived something and come back with a map. She says that feels like the right use of it. The cottage is still ours. End of Tam, Alsa. The dock needs a coat of paint. The birch is stacked. The loons are gone for winter now, but they'll be back in May, the way they always are. Calling across the water in that sound that means something about this place. Something about continuity. Something about the fact that some things are more durable than the schemes people build against them. I am 63 years old. I am not elderly. I am not confused. I am not in need of managing. I am a man who drove up to his cottage on a clear October afternoon and walked through a door that changed what I understood about my family and myself. I am a man whose wife didn't sign her name. I am a man whose younger son drove 3 hours without being told why. Because he heard something in his father's voice. I am a man who still sits on that dock. And if you are watching this and you are somewhere in your 60s or your 70s or your 80s, or you have parents in any of those years, I want you to hear what I am about to say as plainly as I can say it. Know where your documents are. Know what they say. Know who your lawyer is. And speak to them yourself, not through someone else. Know that love and intent are not the same thing. Know that the people most likely to have access to your life are the people closest to you. And that access, without oversight, is a vulnerability regardless of how much you trust the person holding it. Know that you are allowed to protect what you built. The tea is still on the counter up at the cottage. My wife put a new box of chamomile in the cupboard last visit, and every time I see it I think about the fact that she asked to call me before signing and was told not to worry me. She should have called me. She would have, if she'd felt like herself. That's what I think about now when I drive that 400 meters of birch and poplar down to the water, not the fear of what almost happened, but the gratitude for what didn't. The dock is still gray and weathered, and needs that paint. And come spring, we will do it together.